The King, by Alec Cocan. Prologue. The year was 1942, and Brexingham Palace stood as it always had, a monument to power and tradition, a fortress of the old world in an era increasingly uncertain. Its pale stone walls glowed faintly under the soft haze of moonlight, their centuries-old strength seemingly immune to the ravages of time. The great iron gates, adorned with intricate crests of gold, were sealed tight against the outside world, yet the air beyond them was charged, alive with whispers carried on the cold London breeze. For 50 years, the world had known peace. No wars had stained its lands or splintered its alliances since the Great Concord was forged. Empires grew quietly, borders remained static, and the horrors of global conflict became little more than distant, bitter memories preserved in textbooks and solemn anniversary speeches. Prosperity followed peace, but so did complacency. For decades, the shadow of war seemed unthinkable. A relic of a darker age humanity had finally transcended. But peace, like all things, was fragile, and history had a way of circling back on itself. Across the continent, in a nation once subdued, the winds of ambition had begun to stir again. In Germany, a man named Wilhelm Stark had risen with a voice that echoed through the halls of power, capturing the fears and anger of a restless people. He spoke not of unity but of domination, not of peace but of power reclaimed. His words carried the spark of something familiar and dangerous, something Europe had vowed never to ignite again. The Crown, as always, watched with guarded silence. Brexingham Palace had weathered centuries of turmoil, its halls echoing with the footsteps of monarchs who had shaped the world. But within those gilded walls, there was unease, a sense that the steady, unyielding rhythm of the past 5 decades was shifting. The whispers of diplomats and advisors grew louder, warnings laced with urgency as they reached the ears of Queen Margaret. She had ruled for decades with a steady hand, her strength a quiet, indomitable force that had guided her nation through prosperity and change. But even she, with all her experience and resolve, could not escape the growing sense that the world she had safeguarded was beginning to fracture. The decisions before her weighed heavily, and as the first signs of her failing health emerged, the burden of leadership became all the more profound. Outside the palace, the world carried on as it always did. London was a city of contrasts, its cobbled streets and narrow alleys pulsing with life against the backdrop of its ancient architecture. The Thames cut through the heart of it all, its waters murky and cold, reflecting the glow of gas lamps and the faint shimmer of stars. In the quiet of night, the city seemed at peace, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a subtle shift in the air that no one could quite name. Brexingham Palace itself seemed to mirror that tension. Its grand halls, adorned with tapestries and portraits of rulers long past, held a quiet that was almost oppressive. The towering marble columns and polished floors, once a source of comfort and strength, now felt like the walls of a fortress waiting for a siege. The weight of history, of duty, pressed down on those who walked its halls, none more so than Queen Margaret's only son. Prince Henry, once content to linger in the background, could feel the tides turning. The whispers in the palace no longer spoke only of his personal failures, but of his looming responsibility. The world was changing, and with it, his life. Soon the burden of the crown would fall to him, not in the distant future he had once imagined, but sooner, perhaps, than anyone dared admit. Outside the palace gates, the rain began to fall, softly at first, then heavier, as if the sky itself were mourning. It washed over the cobblestones and the towering spires of London, pooling in the labyrinthine walkways of its cathedral and coursing down the windows of its royal halls. It was a storm that whispered of things to come, a warning that peace, however enduring, was never eternal. This was the calm before the storm, and though the world did not yet know it, history was about to be rewritten. Chapter 1. Crown of Thorns. Our story begins on October 7th, 1941, in London, England. The room was colder than it had any right to be. Despite the fire crackling in the distant hearth, the vast library of Brexingham Palace seemed to swallow its warmth, leaving the air sharp and still. Prince Henry sat at one end of a table so long it might as well have been an airfield, the polished surface gleaming like a sheet of ice. Across from him, his mother, Queen Margaret, presided at the head, her gaze unyielding, flanked by the Prime Minister and members of the Royal Council, their polished faces sharp as knives, their collective judgment heavier than the weight of the chandelier above. The rhythmic patter of rain against the windows seemed almost mocking in the silence, broken only by the faint crackling of the fire. And the palace itself? It was more than a home. It was a monument to power, its pale Portland stone walls rising against the city like the face of a stern god. Wide, arching windows stared blankly over the frost-dusted grounds, indifferent to the human struggles within. The great gates, adorned with gilded crests, whispered secrets of duty and blood, of lives lived under their shadow. Within, the hallways stretched on endlessly, a labyrinth of marble floors and gilded moldings where footsteps vanished into the silence. It was not a place of warmth or life. It was a mausoleum of expectations, where the dead watched over the living, their stories woven into the tapestries and the shadows cast by golden sconces. The library in which Henry sat was no exception. Its vaulted ceilings soared above, like the heavens themselves, beams of gold tracing intricate patterns that spiraled like veins through pale stone. A crystal chandelier hung at its center, its facets refracting light in cold shards that danced across the walls. It gleamed ominously, as if daring to fall and punish those who dared challenge the weight of history beneath it. On the walls, oil paintings of former kings and queens stared down from gilded frames, their eyes cold and detached. They seemed to watch Henry, their disapproval palpable. Between them hung tapestries, dulled by age but vivid in their depictions of triumph and conquest, each thread a reminder of the legacy he was expected to uphold. And yet, the chill in the room seemed to seep from these very reminders, as if the ghosts of the past were whispering their disdain into the air. The table itself stretched like a river of dark mahogany, its polished surface cold and unyielding. Chairs, tall and imposing, lined its length with military precision. Draped in crimson velvet, they were thrones for those who wielded power not with swords, but with words sharp enough to cut deeper. The fire in the distant hearth was too far away to offer comfort, its light flickering weakly against the oppressive shadows. Henry's gaze flicked to the empty chair across from him, and then to the faces surrounding the table. His mother, Queen Margaret, sat with a regal poise that could crush lesser men. Beside her, the Dowager Queen, his grandmother, embodied the cold elegance of someone who had survived 2 kings and buried more friends than she cared to count. Her pearl necklace gleamed against the dark velvet of her gown, her expression unreadable, though her mere presence demanded submission. And there, next to her, was Lord Armitage, her current husband, whose smirk suggested he found these proceedings amusing. To him, it was all a game, a sport he could watch from the comfort of his seat in the shadows of power. Henry tightened his jaw, his breath steady, though his chest felt heavier with each passing moment. He didn't know why he had been summoned, but the air in the room was heavy with something unsaid, foreboding, like the charge before a storm breaks. He shifted slightly, his broad shoulders straightening instinctively. By all accounts, Prince Henry was strikingly handsome, though his family rarely acknowledged it aloud. His skin carried a healthy tan, an anomaly in the perpetual grey of London skies, and his features, sharp and precise, seemed almost too perfect, as if carved by an artist's hand. His piercing green eyes, so vivid they seemed to glow, were fixed forward, holding secrets no one dared to uncover. Every detail of him, from his dark, meticulously styled hair to the cut of his military-style coat, exuded defiance. The deep navy fabric was embroidered with gold, catching the flickering light with each movement, while the high black collar framed his strong jawline. His fitted trousers emphasized the athletic build he had honed over years of riding and fencing, and his boots shone with a polish so perfect it reflected the distant firelight. His appearance was deliberate, a rebellion against tradition disguised as elegance. Where his ancestors had worn their duty like armor, Henry wore his identity like a crown. But tonight, the cold pressed against him like a second skin, and not even the fire of defiance could chase it away. He clasped his hands beneath the table, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface. In his jacket pocket, tucked away where no one could see, rested a letter, a small token from Alex. The edges were worn from being read too often, but its presence anchored him, its words a silent reminder of a life beyond this room. As the Prime Minister cleared his throat, Henry glanced toward his mother. The firelight caught the sharp lines of her face, her eyes narrowing as though she were preparing to deliver a blow. Whatever storm was brewing, Henry could feel its weight gathering above him, threatening to break. Henry was 27, an age by which most expected a prince, especially this prince, to have grown into the man they wanted him to be. His upbringing had been one of careful design, tutors drilling him on history and statecraft, nannies ensuring his manners were impeccable, and endless lessons on how to be seen without ever truly being known. The gilded halls of Brexingham Palace had shaped him, but they had failed to tame him. Beneath the polished exterior was a man who craved something more than marble and tradition. From an early age, Henry had found solace in water, oceans, rivers, lakes. Their movement, their refusal to be contained, mirrored something restless within him. He would disappear for hours as a child, wading barefoot into streams or crouching by ponds to watch dragonflies skim across the surface. The water was alive, unpredictable, and free, a sharp contrast to the rigid expectations of the palace. Horses, too, became part of his sanctuary. Henry shared an unspoken understanding with them, a bond that required no words. As a boy, he had spent countless hours in the stables, brushing down manes with small, careful hands or slipping treats into soft, eager mouths. As he grew, he became a skilled rider, finding peace in the rhythmic pounding of hooves against the earth. The countryside stretched endlessly before him, open and vast, a reminder that life could exist beyond the suffocating confines of court. Yet, his love for animals often set him apart from the men who surrounded him, lords, generals, and politicians who saw blood sports as the ultimate symbol of power and masculinity. Henry had always refused to hunt, a stance that earned him quiet disdain. They called him soft, weak, a prince too delicate for the rigors of tradition. But Henry remained unmoved. He would not find sport in the suffering of a living thing. No amount of ridicule could force him to betray that part of himself. To those who truly knew him, Henry's connection to nature was more than a preference. It was an act of defiance. The crown demanded restraint, control, and artifice, but Henry found freedom in the untamed. The crash of waves against a shore, the steady rhythm of hooves, the wag of a dog's tail, all of it reminded him that there was a world beyond Brexingham's cold walls. In those moments, he felt real, unseen by judgmental eyes, untouched by the expectations that sought to mold him into something he was not. But as he sat at the gleaming table, the weight of those expectations pressed down on him like the chandelier above, its crystal facets refracting the light into sharp fragments. Hidden in his jacket pocket was Alex's letter. Henry had slipped it there before entering the library, the words within a quiet anchor as he braced himself for whatever storm was coming. He thought of Alex's handwriting, confident yet slightly uneven, the way it mirrored the man himself. Perfect smiles, careless charm, and a touch of irreverence. It reminded him of something he could never have here: warmth. "Prince Henry," the Prime Minister's smooth, unfeeling voice cut through the silence, jolting him from his thoughts. "Do you know why you're here?" Henry shook his head, forcing himself to sit straighter, though his posture fell short of his mother's rigid elegance. "No, sir, I don't." The Prime Minister turned to Queen Margaret, granting her the floor as though it were hers by divine right. She inclined her head slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing as they locked on Henry, her expression cold and calculating. "The Council has raised concerns," she said, her tone clipped and deliberate, "about your readiness to inherit the crown. And to be frank, Henry, so have I." The words landed like stones, each one heavier than the last. Henry blinked, his chest tightening. "The crown?" "Yes, the crown," Lady Hawthorne sneered. Her frost-coloured hair swept back like a helmet. Her voice dripped with disdain as she leaned forward, her presence cold and domineering. "Or are you too lost in your daydreams to remember what that means?" A sharp, grating laugh came from Lord Armitage, who sat back in his chair with the smirk of a man who found joy in others' discomfort. "Give him time, my dear. He spent so long chasing after his little projects." Henry felt the room closing in on him, the air thick with judgment. "I don't understand. What exactly have I done wrong?" "What haven't you done wrong?" Sir Linwood, a hawk-nosed advisor, shot back. His thin lips curled into a sneer as he leaned forward with venomous interest. "You flit from one hobby to another like a child chasing butterflies. Artist, historian, rider. You try everything but finish nothing. You call it passion. We call it laziness." Henry's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm trying to figure out what I love. I'm trying to understand what I can bring to." "To what?" Queen Margaret's voice sliced through his words like ice. "To this family, to this nation. What have you brought, Henry? A stack of paintings no one cares to look at. A few meaningless speeches." "And look at him," Lady Hawthorne chimed in, her hand sweeping toward Henry in a gesture of mockery. "If he cannot even carry himself like a king, how can he ever rule like one? That hair, that posture, how many times have you been told to sit up straight?" Henry's fists clenched beneath the table, his nails pressing into his palms. His grandmother, the Dowager Queen, cleared her throat, silencing the room like the toll of a bell. Her voice, calm and deliberate, cut sharper than any of the others. "Your appearance does matter, Henry." She leaned forward, her pearl necklace catching the light, her eyes unblinking. "When the people look at you, they must see strength, purpose, dignity. You present none of these things." Henry's fingers brushed against Alex's letter, still tucked in his pocket. For a fleeting moment, he thought of pulling it out, holding it as a shield against their words. But he didn't. The warmth he had felt earlier seemed to retreat, leaving him cold and exposed. "And then there are your so-called manuscripts," Lady Hawthorne began, her voice dripping with disdain, each word honed to wound. "You spend months, years, shut away in rooms, scribbling your little stories. And for what? A stack of papers no one will ever read." Henry's heart tightened, though his face betrayed nothing. He forced himself to meet her cold stare, the weight of her words settling like a stone in his chest. "I write because I love it," he said quietly, his voice steady but softer than he intended. "Because it matters to me, matters to you." Sir Linwood sneered, leaning forward with the eagerness of a predator sensing weakness. "You've locked yourself away like some tortured artist, filling drawer after drawer with half-finished nonsense. And for what? Fiction? Fantasy? Henry, even if you did finish one, who would read it? Who would care?" Henry's fists clenched beneath the table, his nails biting into his palms. "It's not nonsense," he said, his voice sharper now, trembling with the effort to hold back anger. "I've built worlds, stories full of meaning, of hope, and assistance to tidy up your ramblings, I'm sure," Queen Margaret cut in, her tone colder than the marble beneath their feet. "You've had people fetch your notes, type your drafts, smooth your sentences. You call yourself a writer, but the truth is, you hide behind your scribbles. You call it art, but it's a waste of time." Henry flinched. The words struck harder than he anticipated, their sting leaving a hollow ache in his chest. "I don't hide," he said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "I've written hundreds of pages." "Pages that gather dust," Lord Armitage interrupted with a laugh, his voice grating and unpleasant as it echoed through the cavernous room. "I imagine you have quite the collection of stories no one has ever asked for, and no one will ever see. That's not a passion, Henry. It's a hobby, and a fruitless one at that." "Perhaps," Queen Margaret said, her gaze unflinching, her voice sharp enough to cut. "You'd be better served focusing on something that matters, something real. Stories will not make you a king." The Dowager Queen, who had been silent until now, tilted her head slightly, her pearl earrings catching the flickering light. When she spoke, her words were calm, but no less cutting. "Escapism, Henry. That's what it is. You hide behind your fantasies because reality is too much for you. You bury yourself in make-believe worlds when you should be shaping the one that actually exists." Her words landed like a blow. Henry swallowed hard, fighting against the knot tightening in his throat. "You don't understand," he said quietly, barely above a whisper. "Writing is the one thing that feels mine. You don't have to care, but you could try to see it. To see me." "You?" Lady Hawthorne scoffed, her laughter sharp and bitter. "We do see you, Henry. a prince who wastes his days on childish dreams, too fragile to face the responsibilities ahead of him. "You see what you want to see," Henry shot back, louder now, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger. "You dismiss my work because it doesn't look like yours. You call it useless because it doesn't fit your narrow idea of value. I may not have finished a book yet, but those words mean something to me. And therein lies the problem," Queen Margaret said, her tone final like a gavel striking wood. "This isn't about you, Henry. It never has been." The words rang out, silencing the room. The fire crackled faintly in the hearth, but its warmth was absent, swallowed by the cold air pressing in around him. Henry let his gaze drift over the faces surrounding him, his mother's sharp disapproval, his grandmother's detached indifference, Lord Armitage's smirk, and the sneers of the council. They didn't see him. Not the worlds he had created, not the dreams he had poured onto those pages, not the fragments of himself he had left behind in his stories. To them, he was just another failure, another disappointment. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until Henry pushed back his chair. The scrape of wood against marble shattered the stillness like a thunderclap. He rose to his feet, his fists trembling at his sides, his pulse pounding in his ears. Their voices blurred into a dull hum, their sharp edges fading into meaningless noise. Henry's thoughts drifted to him. Alex. The name surfaced unbidden, a flicker of warmth breaking through the storm inside him. He thought of Alex's crooked smile, the way it tilted just enough to feel like a secret only they shared. He thought of Alex's touch, the way his fingers would linger on Henry's wrist, casual but deliberate, leaving his skin tingling long after. And the kisses. God, the kisses. Those moments, stolen and sacred, were the only times Henry felt truly seen. He could still feel Alex's hands on his face, strong and sure, as if holding Henry in place would keep the world from pulling them apart. Alex's voice echoed in his mind, teasing and warm. What would he say if he saw this? If he saw Henry standing here, facing them? Would he laugh it off, his tone careless and irreverent? Or would he pull Henry close and whisper the truth he so desperately needed to hear? "Henry!" His name cracked through the fog like a whip, snapping him back to the room. His head jerked up, and the faces staring back at him seemed almost inhuman, their features cold and pitiless. Queen Margaret's eyes narrowed, her tone like ice. "Are you listening to me, or has your mind wandered back to your distractions?" Henry straightened, locking away the part of himself that dared to feel warmth. "You're all criticizing me, but none of you know me," he said finally, his voice rising with each word. "I am trying. I've spent years trying to prove myself, to find my path, but nothing I do is ever good enough for any of you." The Prime Minister smiled faintly, his tone dripping with condescension. "That is because you're not ready. You're soft, Prince Henry. That's the truth of it. And tough love, painful though it may be, is necessary for you to see it." "Tough love?" Henry spat, his chair scraping harshly as he stood. "This isn't love. This is cruelty." Queen Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unmoving. "Sit down, Henry." But Henry stayed standing, his gaze shifting to his grandmother, searching for something, anything, that might soften the blow. She stared back at him, impassive as stone. Lord Armitage chuckled softly. Defiant. How charming. Henry turned on him sharply. "Charming? You sit there laughing at me while the rest of you tear me apart. I hope you're enjoying the show, Lord Armitage." The older man raised an eyebrow, unbothered. "You'll learn to appreciate this lesson one day, Henry." Henry felt something break inside him, something fragile that had been fraying for years. He turned back to his mother. "If this is what you think makes a king, then I don't want it. I don't want to be you." A hush fell over the room, the weight of the silence pressing down on Henry like a stone. Queen Margaret's voice broke through it, cold and deliberate. "There comes a point, Henry, where we must ask ourselves if you are fit for this family, fit for the crown." Her words struck like a hammer, each syllable calculated to wound. Henry's chest tightened, but he didn't flinch. He locked his jaw, holding her gaze even as her next words came sharper. "Henry, this world has been at peace for the last 50 years. There has never been a world war thanks to this country's leadership. The onus for peace falls on us, on me." She paused, her gloved hands resting lightly on the arms of her chair, her sharp eyes catching the firelight. "I don't think you fully comprehend what's at stake here. The Germans grow increasingly unstable, and the situation becomes more precarious by the day. This crown must stand as a symbol of strength, of stability, of unity. Anything less, and we risk unraveling everything we've built." Henry felt the familiar coil of her rhetoric tighten in his chest. The crown, stability, duty, always the same speeches, the same carefully chosen words to remind him of his insignificance beneath the weight of their golden inheritance. He let out a breath, measured and deliberate. "You speak as though I've done something to jeopardize that peace," he said, his tone firm despite the tension simmering beneath it, "as though the world hinges on whether or not I'm the kind of son you approve of." Queen Margaret's jaw tightened, her gloved fingers pressing into the carved arms of her chair. "Do not be obtuse, Henry. This is not about me. It is about what you owe to your country." "Ooh." Henry's brows lifted, defiance glinting in his piercing green eyes. "And what exactly do I owe, Mother? My life? My soul? Should I bleed myself dry to keep the illusion of your perfection intact?" The Prime Minister cleared his throat, a calculated move to diffuse the rising tension. "What Her Majesty is saying," he began smoothly, "is that the crown is the cornerstone of peace and influence in this modern world. It requires sacrifice, yes, but sacrifice with purpose. You, Prince Henry, are the face of the next generation, and a face must be flawless." Henry turned toward the Prime Minister, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "And what happens when that face isn't yours to control? What happens when that face smiles too wide, speaks too honestly, or, God forbid, writes something worth reading?" He let the words hang in the air before shifting his gaze toward his mother. "You never responded to any of my letters, Mother," Henry continued, his tone steady but heavy with quiet hurt. "I poured countless hours, blood, sweat and tears, trying to reach you in a way you'd understand, only to be met with silence." Queen Margaret's lips curled into a cold, dismissive smile. "Of course I never replied, Henry. I threw them straight into the bin," she said, her voice clipped and sharp, each word landing like a slap. "You are not a real writer. You rely on others to polish your so-called work. It's inauthentic, lacking any true merit or creativity. I refuse to waste my time engaging with such nonsense." Her tone was clinical, yet each syllable struck with deliberate cruelty. Henry's jaw tightened as he turned his gaze to his grandmother, his eyes silently pleading for intervention. The Dowager Queen met his gaze with the composure of a marble statue, her expression devoid of warmth or support. The silence between them was colder than any words she could have said. "There is no such thing as subtle cruelty," Henry muttered under his breath, his voice low but laced with bitterness. "What was that?" Queen Margaret snapped, her tone sharpened by suspicion. "Nothing," Henry replied, his words clipped as he turned his eyes away, calculating his next move. Finally, he straightened his posture and lifted his head, a faint, sardonic smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Ah, yes. Let's discuss authenticity," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because authenticity has always been the cornerstone of this family, hasn't it?" He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "Heaven forbid anyone polish something like, say, a speech written by a team of assistants that you conveniently pass off as your own." His arms folded across his chest, his piercing green eyes blazing with defiance. "But please, do go on. I'm absolutely fascinated by your expertise in what constitutes real work." His tone was both mocking and resolute, his words striking at the hollow facade of the room with precision. Lady Hawthorne's scoff cut through the air like a blade. "You see, this is precisely the problem. Petulance, rebellion, frivolity." She tilted her frost-colored head, the diamonds at her throat catching the light. "Your father understood this, Henry. He knew what the crown demanded of him. He wore it with dignity, yet you—" "Do not bring him into this," Henry snapped, his voice sharp enough to silence the room. His pulse pounded in his ears as he caught the flash of surprise in Lady Hawthorne's eyes. He hadn't meant to let them see him fray, but the words had spilled out before he could stop them. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft crackling of the fire, distant and muted. Henry steadied his breath, his chest rising and falling as he tried to pull himself together. Queen Margaret's voice, when it came, was quiet, but no less cutting. "Your father would be ashamed." The words landed like a blow, their weight pressing against Henry's ribs. His breath caught, but he refused to look away, refusing her the satisfaction of seeing him falter. "Perhaps he would," Henry said, his voice low but steady. "Or perhaps he'd see a son who refuses to be molded into something he's not." "Enough!" The Dowager Queen's voice sliced through the air like the snap of a whip, silencing the room with its authority. Her pale eyes locked onto Henry's, unblinking beneath her heavy lids. "Your sentiments are naive, boy. This is not about passion or identity. It is about legacy. Our legacy. Every decision you make, every action you take, whether you wish it or not, defines this family in the eyes of the world. There is no room for distractions, no space for weakness." The words slammed into him like a punch to the chest. Henry blinked, the firelight catching the faint sheen of moisture in his eyes as he tried to process what he had just heard. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice quieter now, edged with disbelief. The Prime Minister leaned forward, his thin lips curling into a grim, calculated smile. "It's quite simple, Your Highness. If you wish to remain a part of this family, if you wish to keep your place in the line of succession, you will abandon these distractions. Tonight." His hand waved dismissively, as though the things Henry cherished were nothing more than smudges to be scrubbed away. "The writing, the art, the endless dabbling, this nonsense stops, and it stops now. In fact," he added, a smirk flickering across his face, "we've already taken the liberty of having staff clear out your collection of pens, papers, notebooks, and that typewriter you cling to so desperately. All of it. It belongs in the bin, and that's precisely where it is now." Henry's breath caught, his chest tightening as the words sank in. His fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles whitening under the pressure. "You threw out my art supplies, my notebooks, my typewriter?" His voice wavered, trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You don't get to do that. Those things weren't yours." The sharp sting of betrayal cut deeper than he could have anticipated, and he felt the hot burn of tears threatening to spill. The Dowager Queen remained impassive, tilting her head slightly, her expression as unyielding as marble. She didn't so much as blink at his outburst, her voice calm and devoid of any trace of empathy. "This is simple, Henry. If you refuse to rise to the occasion, if you cannot find a career that brings respect and dignity to this family, and you fail to do so before Christmas, then yes, we will have no choice. The monarchy cannot and will not be tainted by your childish whims." Her words were a hammer striking an already fractured heart, each syllable crushing the remnants of his resolve. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of their ultimatum pressing down like a vice. But Henry refused to break. He drew a shaky breath, his anger simmering beneath the surface, ready to boil over. "Childish whims?" Henry's voice quivered with restrained fury. "You think creating something from nothing, building intricate worlds rich with emotion, crafting ideas so unique they could never be replicated, is childish? Do you even hear yourselves? You're not just dismissive, you're heartless. No, worse, you're monsters." "Henry Ryan Ashford III," Queen Margaret began, her voice cutting like glass as she deliberately invoked his full name, a rare and calculated gesture. "You are a prince, not a painter," she snapped, her tone sharp and unrelenting. "Not a writer, not a dreamer, not a thinker. Your duty is to this family, its traditions, and to this nation, not to your little fantasies. If you cannot fulfill that duty, if you cannot prove yourself worthy, then we will take everything, your title, your position, your home." Henry staggered back as though struck, the weight of her words pressing against him like a vice. "You disown me? Call it whatever you like," the Prime Minister said, flicking his hand as if brushing away an inconvenience. "Disown, exile, render homeless. If you refuse to conform to the expectations of this family, then you forfeit your right to remain. And what standards are those?" Henry demanded, his voice rising with every word, echoing through the cavernous room. "Being cold, unfeeling, sacrificing everything that makes me who I am just to satisfy your narrow idea of duty. I will not spend my life as a hollow shell, parading around to make you feel secure in your warped vision of perfection. I'd rather sleep on the streets, free and true to myself, than rot in here, faking it until I make it. Henry, you will do what is required of you, Margaret said, her voice quiet but lethal. Or you will lose everything. Henry's chest heaved, his thoughts spinning as though the ground beneath him had given way. His eyes darted from face to face, his mother's sharp disapproval, the Dowager Queen's unshakable authority, the Prime Minister's smug indifference, and he realized in that moment that they would do it. They would cast him aside without hesitation, without remorse. For them, Henry was expendable. His dreams were expendable. Make your choice, Henry, Queen Margaret said, her voice heavy with finality. The crown, or your life as it is now, though I hardly need to remind you, it's already unraveling before our eyes. Henry's fists clenched, his voice rising in fury. Yes, but you're the ones holding the scissors. He paused, his chest heaving as he locked eyes with her, his voice trembling but resolute. They're not distractions. They're who I am. And if that's not good enough for you, then maybe the problem isn't me, it's the crown. The silence that followed was deafening, the fire crackling faintly in the hearth. For a moment, Henry could still feel the ghost of Alex's touch against his wrist, a fleeting warmth in a room grown impossibly cold. He locked his jaw, drawing strength from the memory as he prepared to stand his ground. The Dowager Queen's voice cut through the tense air, her tone sharper than the crackling fire. We haven't even discussed the matter of your dog. Henry froze, his heart lurching. What about Remy? Queen Margaret's gaze was steady and unyielding, like a hawk sizing up its prey. Remington is no longer in your custody, Henry. The words didn't register at first. Henry blinked, his breath catching in his throat as her meaning sank in. What? His voice was low, disbelieving. He straightened in his chair, his fists clenching against the polished table. What do you mean, no longer in my custody? Lady Hawthorne was the first to respond, her voice dripping with false concern. Given the dog's behavior and your clear inability to manage it, we've had no choice but to take action. Remington has been removed from your care and placed under special supervision. 100 thoughts raced through Henry's mind, each more troubling than the last. Special supervision. What did that mean? His heart clenched as his mind spiraled, imagining Remy confined to a small, cold kennel, trapped in darkness. Was he safe? Was he happy? Or was he merely abandoned, hated, forgotten, left to wither in isolation? The uncertainty gnawed at Henry, each scenario more unbearable than the one before. You've kidnapped my child. Henry's voice cracked, the tremor of panic giving way to a surge of anger. Remy is my dog, my responsibility. You had no right. We had every right. Kidnapped? Don't be ridiculous. Queen Margaret cut in, her tone as icy as the room's chill. As long as that animal resides under this roof, it must adhere to the rules. That dog's behavior has been a concern since the moment it could walk. It jumps on people, begs for attention, disrupts order, and embarrasses this family at every turn. You've clearly failed to train it properly. Henry shot to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. That's not true. He's a demanding breed, yes, but I've done everything I can for him. He's not aggressive. He's young, energetic. He's learning. Sir Linwood sneered, his hawk-like features twisting into a smug smirk. You call letting it barrel into guests and leap onto furniture learning? It's undisciplined and under-exercised, Henry. When was the last time you walked that dog yourself without pawning the task off on staff? Henry's hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. You don't understand anything about Remy. He's a Doberman, spirited, independent, and fiercely loyal. Training takes time, and I've been patient. I've worked with him every single day, and failed. Queen Margaret interrupted sharply, her gaze piercing. This isn't about the breed, Henry. It's about you, your lack of discipline, your inability to establish order. A dog's behavior reflects its master, and Remington's antics perfectly illustrate why you are unfit to lead. He's not an antique vase you can just remove because you don't like how it looks in the room. Henry spat, his voice rising with fury, his emerald eyes blazing. He's a living, breathing creature, a part of my life, my family. That the Dowager Queen interjected coldly, her words cutting like glass, "is precisely the problem. You treat him like a child when he is nothing more than a dog, and an unruly one at that." "He's not just a dog," Henry shot back, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "He's loyal, loving, and always there for me when no one else is. He's my everything, my world. You don't care about him, and you never did. Admit it, you hated him from the moment I brought him home. I saw how you treated Ronan compared to Remy. You didn't even try to hide it. All Remy ever wanted was love, and you couldn't even give him that. Because he's inappropriate for someone in your position," Queen Margaret replied, her tone cold and precise. "Inappropriate?" Henry snapped, his eyes narrowing with fury. "So you admit it then? You hate him, just like you hate me." "Henry, what kind of prince parades around with a dog that jumps on dignitaries, defiles gardens, and tears through the palace halls like some untamed beast?" Queen Margaret's voice sharpened with every word. "You've embarrassed this family enough with your antics. We will not allow your dog to add to that list. You think this is about embarrassment?" Henry's voice cracked with incredulity. "This is about control. This is manipulation. You think taking him will somehow make me more focused, more obedient. But all you've done is show how far you'll go to tear me down." Lady Hawthorne leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a smug smile. "If losing a dog is enough to undo you, then perhaps it's time you reevaluate your priorities." Henry turned on her, his green eyes blazing with fury. "You have no idea what he means to me. You sit there passing judgment, but you don't care about his well-being, or mine. You're using him to hurt me because you think it'll make me more like you. But it won't. It'll just make me hate you more." Queen Margaret rose from her chair, her gloved hands pressing against the table as she stared him down. "This is tough love, Henry. You need to learn to stand on your own. Remington has been a crutch for too long, enabling your weaknesses. It's time you grow up." Henry stared at her, his breath heaving as he tried to contain the storm inside him. "You think you're helping me?" His voice was quieter now, trembling with barely restrained emotion. "You're not. You're destroying the one thing in my life that's kept me grounded, that's kept me sane. We are preparing you for reality," the Dowager Queen said, her tone cold and unyielding. "And the reality is this: leaders don't have the luxury of indulgence. It's time you learn to prioritize duty over sentimentality." Henry let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "That's absurd. Duty over sentimentality? No, what you really mean is power over compassion, manipulation and control over understanding and support. You've just proven, yet again, that you care more about appearances than the people you claim to lead. You don't want a king, you want a puppet. But I won't be a king like you, a king without a heart." The council fell silent, their sharp gazes locked on him as his words hung in the air. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth failing to reach him as he stood frozen in place. Without a word, Henry turned away, his back to them, his posture rigid with defiance. He refused to let them see the tears welling in his eyes, threatening to spill. Not now, not ever. The sting of unshed tears burned as he blinked hard, willing them to stay hidden. Remy was gone. The thought cut through him like a blade. How could they? His mind screamed, but his lips stayed pressed in a thin line. He closed his eyes, drawing in a trembling breath, letting the heavy silence speak for him, louder than any words ever could. "We also need to discuss your faith," Lady Hawthorne said, her tone cutting and laced with disdain, as though the very word left a bitter taste in her mouth. "This obsession you cling to, sitting around all day, waiting for God to solve your problems, chanting those insufferable mantras of yours. And let's not even start on that dreadful music you insist on playing, foreign, incomprehensible, and frankly unbearable. Who could endure more than a few seconds of it?" She wrinkled her nose as though offended by the mere memory, her words dripping with contempt. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement, their faces twisted with smug approval, as though Lady Hawthorne had dared to say what they were all thinking. Henry's head snapped toward her, his jaw tightening. "My faith isn't an obsession." "Oh, is it not?" Lady Hawthorne pressed on, her icy gaze unwavering. "You speak of your writing and your art as though they were sacred texts, and then you waste hours in chapels on your knees, as though prayer alone will deliver you purpose. "You know nothing about my faith," Henry said, his voice low but carrying an edge that silenced the room. Queen Margaret seized the moment, her voice cutting through the charged air like a blade. "Faith? Is that what you call it, Henry? A convenient excuse to avoid action, to avoid responsibility. Tell me, has God written your speeches for you? Has he finished those stories you never seemed capable of completing? Or do you wait for him to pick up the pen when you've grown tired of it?" The Prime Minister smirked, leaning back in his chair as though savouring the spectacle. "Faith, Your Highness, is no substitute for action. A king cannot hide in a chapel. A king must lead, command, build something tangible. And yet you do nothing," Sir Linwood added, his voice dripping with scorn. "You wait, you dream, you pray, expecting God to hand you a purpose, a legacy, as though he were some benevolent servant ready to do your bidding." He scoffed, gesturing toward Henry dismissively. "It's lazy, Henry. You hide behind your so-called faith because you are too afraid to take a real step forward." Henry's fists clenched, his knuckles white. "I don't hide behind it," he growled, his voice barely restrained. "My faith gives me strength. You call it waiting, I call it listening. I call it believing in something bigger than your narrow, cynical world." "Strength?" Queen Margaret's cold voice sent a chill through him. "Strength requires action, Henry, not waiting on divine intervention. If your God has a plan for you, he is taking far too long to reveal it." The words cut through the air like shards of glass, unrelenting and impossible to ignore. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, a faint counterpoint to the silence that followed. For the first time, the council seemed stunned, their faces etched with something between shock and unease. Even Queen Margaret's expression flickered, not much, but enough for Henry to catch the shadow of something unspoken before her features hardened once more. It was the Dowager Queen who finally broke the silence, her voice calm and razor-sharp. "You mistake conviction for action, Henry. Trust in God all you like, but do not expect him to do your work for you. Dreamers accomplish nothing without action, Henry, and action requires sacrifice, yours most of all." Henry straightened, his trembling hands now steady as he met her gaze. She had once been his sanctuary, the woman who spun him bedtime stories of knights and kings, tales of bravery and hope. But as he stared into her pale, unyielding eyes, he saw only the shadow of that woman, someone who had long since abandoned the legends she used to tell. Henry's fists slammed into the table with such force that the sound echoed through the room like a thunderclap. The council flinched, their poised facades cracking as they recoiled in surprise. Even Queen Margaret's icy composure wavered, her gloved hands gripping the arms of her chair. "Enough!" Henry's voice roared, filling the vast library like a storm unleashed. He rose to his feet, his piercing green eyes blazing with fury as he looked from face to face. "You sit here, perched on your thrones of judgment, pretending to know what leadership is, what sacrifice is, what faith is, but you know nothing. Nothing." His gaze locked on Lady Hawthorne, who shrank back ever so slightly. "You mock my faith, call it an obsession, dismiss it as weakness. But what do you believe in? Your pearls? Your titles? The sound of your own voice as you spew your venom? You're nothing but a hollow shell dressed in lace." He turned to Sir Linwood, who had the nerve to sneer even now. "And you, with your snide remarks and your wisdom, what have you ever built? What have you ever stood for that wasn't designed to prop up your own fragile ego? You call me lazy, a dreamer. At least I dream. At least I have the courage to try." His voice dropped, but the intensity only grew as he turned to Queen Margaret. "And you, Mother. You who threw my letters in the bin, who wouldn't even give me the dignity of acknowledgement. You talk of duty, of sacrifice, but what have you ever sacrificed? Your heart? Your humanity? You've sacrificed nothing because you've never had anything to lose." The Dowager Queen opened her mouth to interject, but Henry silenced her with a glare that could have frozen fire. "Don't you dare. You sit there, speaking of legacy as if it's some sacred thing, as if it's worth more than the people who bear its weight. But your legacy is one of cruelty, of control, of turning love into a transaction." He straightened, his shoulders squared as he glanced at each of them one last time. "You're not leaders, you're tyrants. Petty, spiteful tyrants clinging to a crumbling pedestal. And one day, when that pedestal finally collapses, You'll realize too late that you have nothing left. No love, no loyalty. Nobody left to buy your bullshit. Lady Hawthorne let out a dramatic gasp, clutching her necklace as though Henry's words had physically struck her. Her eyes darted between Queen Margaret and the Dowager Queen, silently pleading for them to respond. But both women remained still, their faces masks of forced composure. They knew better than to provoke him further. After all, this room housed priceless, irreplaceable relics of the monarchy. The last thing they needed was a tantrum that ended with shattered history. "Don't act so shocked," Henry growled, rolling his eyes with a contemptuous sneer. He didn't wait for a retort. Instead, he turned sharply and strode toward the grand double doors, his impeccably tailored jacket flowing behind him like a velvet cape, brushing against the polished marble with each step. The sharp staccato of his boots echoed through the room, amplifying the tense silence that had descended upon the council. As he reached the doors, he paused, his hand resting firmly on the cold golden handle. Without turning fully, he cast one last glance over his shoulder, his piercing green eyes blazing with unyielding defiance. They landed on each of them like the final blow of a judge's gavel. "Perhaps God is waiting for me to act on his behalf," he said, his voice calm yet cutting, each word a deliberate challenge. "And trust me, I will. But not for you." As Henry's hand gripped the golden handle of the door, preparing to leave the council and its suffocating judgment behind, the heavy doors suddenly shifted under his touch. An aide, pale and breathless, burst through the opening, his uniform slightly disheveled, as though he had been running. "Your Majesty, your Highnesses," the aide stammered, his voice quaking with urgency. "You must turn on the radio at once. The German leader, Wilhelm Stark, is about to make an unscheduled address to the nation." The room, already frozen in tense silence, seemed to draw even tighter. A ripple of unease passed through the council, their sharp gazes exchanging glances of alarm. Even the Dowager Queen's impassive demeanor faltered, her pearl-clad hand tightening over the arm of her chair. Henry's heart clenched at the name, a knot of dread settling low in his stomach. He remained motionless, caught between his own fiery departure and the new storm that seemed poised to break. The aide's voice cracked through the silence again, desperate. "It's already begun." The weight of Stark's name lingered in the air like smoke. The tension in the library thickened, pressing against Henry's chest like an iron vice. Without a word, Queen Margaret gestured sharply for the radio to be brought in, her icy composure now edged with a quiet urgency. Henry took a step back into the room, his anger momentarily displaced by curiosity and something far colder. As the radio crackled to life, the static gave way to the chilling resonance of Stark's voice, calm and measured, while the English translator spoke over him.
German brothers and sisters, today we stand on the brink of a new era, an era defined by the indomitable strength of our people, a people created to lead and rule the world. The world has suffered long enough under the weakness of the so-called great nations, under their decadence, their corruption, their moral depravity. But now, our time has come. Germany will no longer remain in the shadows. We will fulfill our true destiny and unite the world under our leadership. We will show no pity, no mercy. England, that rotten empire that has risen on the backs of the weak, will shatter like brittle wood under the pressure of our might. We will turn their islands into smoke and ash and overthrow their false kings. The German flag will wave from coast to coast. Our enemies will tremble before our strength, and our allies will step into our light. There is no longer any room for doubt or weakness. The world belongs to us, and we will take it with an iron fist. Yet, this conquest is not born of hatred alone. It is born of vision. A vision of a world cleansed of impurity, of weakness, of the false ideologies that have poisoned humanity for too long. For centuries, lesser nations and peoples have tainted the fabric of progress. They cling to their frail traditions and call it culture. They stumble in their chaos and call it democracy. But the age of confusion is over. We will bring order to this chaos. The German spirit, unbroken, pure and righteous, will shine as a beacon to the masses. It is not only our duty to conquer, but to purge the world of the filth that threatens its future. The weak will serve the strong, and the strong will lead the world into an age of unyielding glory. We will teach the world discipline, purpose, and unity under the banner of German superiority. The old gods have blessed us with this purpose, and our destiny is clear. Through fire and blood the world will be reborn. But this vision cannot be realized without sacrifice. Every German heart must beat with the fire of determination. Every hand must be ready to wield the tools of war. Our enemies will resist. They will lie, they will cheat, and they will try to undermine us. But they are no match for the iron will of the fatherland. We call upon every German man, woman and child to stand with us in this crusade. To fight not only for Germany, but for the future of humanity itself. The weak will call us tyrants, the envious will call us cruel. But history will call us conquerors, the architects of a new golden age. Prepare yourselves, my people. The time of reckoning is near. The world will bow before us, not out of fear alone, but out of awe. They will see in us the perfection they could never achieve. Together, we will create a world where Germany reigns supreme, a world forged by our blood, our steel, and our unwavering resolve. The time for talk is over. The time for action is now. Heil Deutschland, Heil Victory.
As the broadcast came to a close and the radio switched off, the words hung in the air, the finality of them striking like the toll of a bell. For a moment, the only sounds were the faint crackling of the fire and the distant echo of rain against the windows. Nobody spoke. Not the Prime Minister, not Queen Margaret, not even the ever-critical Lady Hawthorne. The weight of Stark's speech pressed down on the room, heavy and suffocating, a silent acknowledgement that this was no idle threat. Henry's eyes darted to his mother, searching for a reaction, a decision, anything. But Queen Margaret sat frozen, her sharp gaze fixed on the now silent radio, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The council's earlier smugness had evaporated, replaced with something bordering on fear. Finally, Henry broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "He's not offering peace, Mother. He's setting the stage for domination, and you all know it." Queen Margaret's gaze snapped to her son, her expression unreadable. "That may be true," she said, her voice measured, "but the question remains, what will we do about it?" The Dowager Queen cleared her throat, her tone cutting through the silence like a blade. "The Crown must stand resolute. England cannot and will not bow to such threats." Henry took a step forward, his earlier defiance returning with renewed purpose. "Then I recommend we don't just stand, we act. We prepare. Stark isn't waiting for us to decide, he's already moving. If you want to show strength, now is the time." The Prime Minister leaned forward, his fingers steepled under his chin. "And what would you suggest, Your Highness? Another speech about unity and hope? Perhaps another unfinished book of yours to inspire the troops?" Henry shot him a glare sharp enough to cut stone. "No, I'm suggesting we show Stark that England isn't as fractured as he thinks. If he's challenging us, then we answer, not with words, but with actions." The room fell silent once more, the council exchanging uncertain glances. For the first time that evening, Henry felt something shift. They were listening. Whether they would act was another matter entirely. The cold, endless halls of Brexingham Palace stretched before him, vast and empty, their grandeur now a silent witness to the evening's chaos. For the first time, Henry didn't feel small within them. His steps were firm, his shoulders squared, every movement charged with quiet determination. When he reached his room, He shut the door firmly, blocking out the world beyond. Pouring himself a glass of vodka, he downed it quickly before peeling off the trappings of his day. Piece by piece, his polished uniform fell away, revealing the man beneath. His chest, sculpted and powerful, rose and fell with steady breaths. Every line of his body, honed from years of riding and fencing, spoke of strength, even as his mind churned with anger and worry. He collapsed onto the couch, naked and exhausted, the firelight flickering over his skin. His thoughts spiraled, not to the council or their threats, but to Remy. Wherever his dog was, Henry vowed to find him. He wasn't just a pet, he was family. The one soul who offered unconditional love in a world full of judgment. They thought they could break him, strip away his passions, his faith, his dreams. But they had no idea what they had unleashed. If this was war, against his family, against the world, then so be it. Henry would fight for what mattered. And if God was listening, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.